Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 23 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Los Angeles Kings, in which the Sharks have lost 5-2. Now, the most important thing that we have to discuss about this game before anything else has to do with the Sharks reverse retro jerseys. Yes, this is the first time this season that the Sharks have worn these new jerseys. All of the teams around the league got in and made these types of reverse retro jerseys as like a throwback to how the team's logo, or maybe the team that even came prior to this organization's logo, looked, and trying to get a similar theme. So the Sharks, of course, taking a big inspiration from the California Golden Seals. They have the name written out Sharks on the jersey. They've got some gold lines and things like that. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of these jerseys. They're definitely not ugly. I don't hate them, but I would say I am a bit whelmed. They're not blowing me away or anything like that. I find that there are a few jerseys around the league that are really quite nice, but when it comes to the Sharks reverse retro jersey, I find they are slightly plain, so nothing too exciting from that. But onto the actual game itself. This is a game in which the Sharks lost 5-2, which is not the most appealing score, even with that empty netter goal. And yet, I don't think the Sharks actually played all that bad here tonight. In fact, the major reason why they actually lost this game was due to the fact that their goaltending really let them down. Now, usually I discuss the goaltending at the end of the video when I get to either Reimer or Kahkonen, but today going to make a special exception and discuss Reimer immediately right now. Reimer has had a bit of an awkward last couple of games. A couple of games ago, he was up against the Detroit Red Wings and played quite poorly. Now, in that game, at the very least, the Sharks did give up a few grade A chances, and so Reimer, while he did let in a couple of bad ones, he also let in a few that he really didn't have too much of a chance on. However, and then he played a solid, very, very good game against the New York Rangers, in which the Sharks let him down, only gave him a single goal of support, while Reimer only let in a single goal because the second one was an empty netter, and so the Sharks lost that one. And now here tonight, he was even worse than he was against the Detroit Red Wings. There's a very real world where with just good goaltending, the Sharks actually win this game 2-1, because only one of these goals, I would say personally, and that would be the Danault goal, was actually in any way a very difficult shot to stop. And honestly, even that is kind of taking it a bit too far. With great goaltending, the Sharks could very well end up with a shutout here tonight. But Reimer was just really, really off of his game. In particular, the last two goals 3 and 4 from Arvidsson and Kupari, really stick out as ones that should just not be going in. They squeak through Reimer, and you could just see the sort of reaction of the Sharks players when those goals got let in. Maybe thinking back to when they had Martin Jones on the team a few years ago and how deflating the goals that he let in could be, because while the Sharks usually do show some fight in them when they're down a goal or two in the third period, while it wasn't a terrible third period for the San Jose Sharks, there wasn't necessarily as much energy as I was necessarily expecting. Now, this one started off with a Kings goal that ends up getting called off on the offside within the first 45 seconds. So already the Sharks are sort of given a reset to this game, a redo after a bad first shift. But then the Kings still end up with the first goal of the game from Anderson Dolan. It's tied up from a Kevin Labanc goal, but then Danault on the power play makes it 2-1. And this is only a couple games removed from me really praising the Sharks penalty kill, and now they've let in a power play goal in 2 straight games. In the second period, the Kings would expand their lead to 3-1 before the Sharks would get gifted a goal in the last 30 or so seconds of the second to make it 3-2 and set ourselves up for that interesting game. But like I mentioned, Reimer lets in that really bad one from Kupari, and then while the Sharks got some chances, there wasn't a ton, and they end up losing it 5-2. The empty netter from Andrei Kopitar gets added at the end. Pretty bad one, certainly, just because Erik Karlsson comes through the neutral zone, ends up getting a slash to the hands where he was expecting a call. Then he gloves this puck out of the air, but then doesn't really realize where he dropped it or something along those lines. Maybe it just hit his hand. I'm not entirely sure, but the puck was behind him. He doesn't recognize that. Kopitar skates right by him for the empty net goal, and the Sharks lose it 5-2, like I said. On to the players to talk about. I mentioned that was really just the goaltending that stood out like a sore thumb here for the Sharks here tonight. Otherwise, the players actually played pretty decently, I would say, or at least most of them. The first line got a lot of good chances for themselves. Meier, of course, last year he had that 5-goal game against the Los Angeles Kings, and so their first matchup against the Kings here this season, we were going to see what exactly happened. And while Meier obviously didn't get a single goal in this game, he did get an assist and got multiple chances, probably could have even had a goal or two if not for some really heroic goaltending from Jonathan Quick. In particular, he had an amazing save early on in the first period on Timo Meier that really, I believe at the time the game was 0-0, maybe it was 1-0 Kings, I don't entirely remember, but a very solid game for the first line. But I also want to focus a bit more onto Kevin Labanc, who I thought maybe had one of his best games of the entire season here tonight. Labanc truly excelling in this role at the moment. I talked about him in decent length last game in that position in the Seattle game on this first line, but I thought here tonight he was definitely one of the better Sharks players, really looking like a new type of player than what we had seen in last year, his brief time last year, the year before that, finally looking like a player who is living up at least somewhat to that massive contract that Doug Wilson gave him a couple of years ago. On the second line, I also thought Barabanov, Couture, and Nieto looked pretty decent, got a couple of decent chances for themselves. I'm not going to give them a ton of credit for the one goal that they did score because, like I said, kind of gift-wrapped towards them as Barabanov just catches an easy pass from Sean Durzi right in front of the net to beat Jonathan Quick in that situation, but otherwise still at even strength, a pretty solid line for themselves. On the third line, the player who definitely most impressed me here would be Noah Gregor, who had returned to the lineup in the absence of Nico Sturm, who went onto the IR. And Gregor, he was a player who I thought was actually pretty decent at times last season, and so it really seemed, especially near the end when he had that very solid third line with Balcers and Bordelot, and so I thought he'd really be able to lock down a main position on the Sharks roster in the bottom six coming into this year, and potentially even be flexing into the top six in space of someone like Matt Nieto, because it's not as though Matt Nieto really belongs in that particular position. And yet Gregor, and this isn't even necessarily a David Quinn thing where I'm really heavily criticizing him for that, because Gregor really hasn't been all that impressive and has actually been kind of bad at times, especially earlier on, so I was not too disappointed to see him as a healthy scratch. He definitely needed to improve his game to actually deserve a spot in this lineup, and he has definitely managed to do that over these past couple of games. And so once Nico Sturm does return to the lineup, which seems definitely rather close, he may get the spot back on the third line, but Gregor will absolutely remain in the lineup because if we move on to the fourth line at this point, this line is just an absolute disaster. I sort of said decently nice things about them in the previous game because they looked okay, but here tonight, not amazing. I mean, there were a couple of okay chances for themselves. Svechnikov had a decent opportunity, but then he also had a terrible giveaway at one point, and just generally this line is not clicking at all. And so, like I said, once Sturm returns to the lineup, Gregor will either stay in the third line spot and someone like Bonino will move down, or Sturm will just generally take a spot on the fourth line. I'm not entirely sure, but one of these players is going to be the odd man out. I'd like it to be Lindblom at this point, at least for like a short-term moment, just to try and give him a bit of a wake-up call at this point, but realistically it'll probably end up being Svechnikov, and I don't have that much of a problem with that either. On the defensive side of things here for the Sharks, unlike the previous game against the Seattle Kraken, where it was just an absolute disaster, the Sharks led in 7 goals. There was just no redeeming or very little redeeming qualities from the defensive unit. The Sharks actually looked pretty decent defensively here tonight. Didn't actually give the Kings too much to work with. Like I mentioned, it was really the goaltending that kind of sucked here tonight for the Sharks. If you look at goals 3 and 4, yes, there's a bit of room to take those shots. Yes, you could say, oh, the defender needs to get out of the way and not screen his goaltender, but this happens all the time. You're expecting your goalie to still be able to make that save, and so I could definitely understand the frustration, especially that we saw from Erik Karlsson as he was on the ice for a couple of these goals. I could definitely understand that level of frustration from him. Otherwise, on the offensive side of things, Karlsson again making some things happen. I don't believe he actually ended up with a point here tonight, but still was definitely involved in the offense. I also do want to talk about Radim Shemek. He makes a return to the lineup in place of Cicek. Definitely not that much of a surprise that Cicek draws out after, like I said, the disaster disaster that was the Seattle Kraken game. He was not necessarily the problem, but he definitely wasn't the solution in that one either. Simek comes back in. I thought he had an okay game, nothing amazing, but still somewhat decent. And since I already talked about the goaltender Reimer earlier on, there isn't necessarily much else to say there. Just again to emphasize that right now, while Reimer looked like he was going to be the major starter for the San Jose Sharks after his first few strong games and Kahkonen being weak, now the Sharks are in a situation where Reimer has been a bit shaky over his past couple of games besides that game against the Rangers. Kahkonen has been a bit shaky in his past couple of games besides the game against the Senators, and so the Sharks are kind of hoping that one decent option can kind of prop back up. Someone can find some sort of level of consistency. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Sunday, where they will take on the Vancouver Canucks, another team that finds themselves right near the bottom of the standings with the San Jose Sharks, and we'll see if they can take advantage of that like they did against the Canucks, or if they'll end up getting abused by that like it has happened already a couple of times this season against teams like the Anaheim Ducks. Class dismissed.